Yesterday, as we are recording, big news happened, so I knew today would be a very interesting show.
Well, and we can't do anything else but lead with this because of the magnitude of the situation, which had been rumored for some time and had been shot down. But yesterday, as we sit here and talk, Hulk Hogan passed away. They said cardiac arrest. He was at his home. He was 71 years old, and I know a lot of people were instantly tweeting at it. Why aren't you talking about this? It's been not even 24 hours, I don't believe, since the news came out. And when I heard about it a few hours later, I had a face full of Novocaine from sitting in a dentist chair. So we have tried to regroup and think about this as best we can. So we don't need to be the news breakers. We are commentators, and we'll try to analyze things a little bit for the good and the bad. But it surprised me the level of vehemence for the people who had the negative opinion of Hulk Hogan. I figured it would be like, well, when the big star dies or celebrity, a sports figure, even if he was controversial, everybody, kind of goes with it. But is it just social media, Brian, or for the people who loved him or were fans, they were broken up, and for the people who didn't, they weren't? Is it just Twitter? I haven't talked to anybody personally about it, but what the fuck?
I don't think it's just Twitter. I think Twitter certainly magnifies everything a whole lot more, but it's a complicated legacy. There's the legacy and the life of Hulk Hogan, the character, and then there's Terry Bollea, the person who played the character of Hulk Hogan. And, it's certainly a legacy that's taken a lot of hits, a lot of them self-induced over the last 20 years. But a lot of the reaction I saw, and I know a lot of what I was feeling, because, we've had a lot of fun on this show talking about, laughing about the various stories that he would concoct or the things that he would say in these interviews. And of course, there's the infamous tape of him having sex with Bubba the Love Sponge's wife, and then the declarations that he made about himself being a racist afterwards. There's all these things, and there's also at the same time this guy that for a lot of people was the entry to pro wrestling. I became a big fan in '89, and I already knew who a lot of the guys were because of Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling when I was 6, because of the figures that got to the stores when I was 5. I had a Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant action figure before I ever saw them, before I really knew too much about them. And I think for a lot of people, especially my generation, my age group, Hulk Hogan was not only the biggest star of a generation and the face of WWF, but he may be the actual reason you first became aware of wrestlers or wrestling. And I think for a lot of people, the people who still get chills thinking about the Andre the Giant body slam at WrestleMania 3 in '87, the people who still remember the big Saturday night's main events and all the big moments, even the WrestleMania match with The Rock, what a special series of moments that was. It's a tough thing to weigh all of those positive memories and experiences with the conduct, the words, again, and it wasn't just the Bubba
The
thing.
meltdown.
Yeah, I mean, remember, when his son Nick got into that accident, and forgive me for not knowing all the details, the person riding with him was a vegetable pretty much from that point forward.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a big issue. Then there was a tape of like Hulk Hogan going to the prison and, basically, making themselves the victims, not the victim.
Well,
so I mean, there's a lot of things like that, but again, it's hard. There aren't a lot of examples. He wasn't a murderer like OJ, so you can't really say like, look at when OJ died, but it's hard. I think a lot of the mainstream stuff I've seen is kind of focused on, I don't want to necessarily say the positives, but the realities of the magnitude of his star, but everyone does address the scandals. I mean, he brought down Gawker with that lawsuit that Peter Thiel funded. So it's not like he wasn't always in the middle of stuff, but it's a complicated legacy to kind of weigh.
He learned very well in the wrestling business, the old fashioned wrestling business, of how to promote himself, make himself bigger, make himself more important in the days when you couldn't just readily poo-poo a bullshit story and didn't realize he had done so much mainstream publicity where the host or the interviewer or the people involved had almost no knowledge of the inside of the business or even the business in general, that he could just say shit, and he got used to that. And then it came back to bite him as far as the stories that we've made fun of and etc. And the books that he wrote that easily, disprovable, but to the kid that was a fan in those days and then didn't know anything about wrestling for 20 years, he buys Hulk Hogan's book and he buys the whole thing. But there's also a third segment. You talked about the people who loved him and were introduced to wrestling, the fans and or the, people on the other side. As controversial as he was, and as many people as he had been involved in at least somewhat double crossing or, creative controlling or maneuvering or whatever, you saw from a lot of people in the business, they loved him. There were people that loved him in the business, as well as people who were like, Jesse Ventura.
Yeah, I'll give you a great example because I thought about this. Scott Dickinson, one of the real nice guys out there, former WCW referee, refereed a lot of places, but most famously WCW. Years ago, I forget what you and I were talking about, but we were probably laughing about one of Hogan's things. And he got in touch and he told me a story, and I was shocked to hear it. And I don't know if shocked's the right word, but I was really pleasantly surprised. I don't know what. He said that when Brian Hildebrand, referee Mark Curtis in WCW, got sick, when they found out, I guess maybe the first time, or whenever it was, when they found out that the cancer was really bad, somehow word got to Hogan. And he said that they were surprised when all of a sudden Hogan approached Brian Hildebrand and said, "Is there anything I could do?" And I think he even did try to get him in with some doctors or something. That's a story that we didn't hear from Hulk Hogan. So it's not like it's a tale that he just made up. It's something I'm hearing from a friend of Brian Hildebrand's.
Well, that's the thing that I always said about the stories that he was telling, is that his real ones were good enough. He was the big mega sensation in the wrestling business. And there's so many, ways you could have told those stories and not been completely full of shit, and Metallica didn't need to be involved or whatever, because the real stuff, he had something to work with. But that's why, very complicated. And I know I've even had people on Twitter the last days, I can't wait to hear Cornette and Last roast Hogan now that he's gone. I'm like, have we ever been personally mad at each other? You and I and him? We laughed at the bullshit, but he was a big deal in the wrestling business. Now, I wasn't a fan of him being a big deal in the wrestling business while he was a big deal in the wrestling business, because I was on the other side. And it's no secret I was not a fan of the Vince Jr.'s WWF ideas for the 80s with the kiddie program and et cetera, because we were in the NWA and that was wrestling. And, so it was not my cup of tea. I was on the southern side while they were on the northern side. But the thing, actually, I don't think people realize, and I've said it before, that I would say that I have probably been in, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this properly. I've been in the same room with Hulk Hogan in my life like 8 fucking times, maybe. So I had no positive or negative personal interaction with him ever. I think 5 or 6 of those were when I was the photographer in Memphis, and he was here in 1979. I took the pictures. Then once was at the NAPTE convention, the National Association of Television Program Executives in New Orleans, I believe, in 1991. And we passed greetings as he was at a booth and I was at a booth. And that may be the last time ever. So the point is, I'm not going to crow about it. He finally got what was coming to him. Because I barely ever met the fucking guy. But you were a fan as a kid. I was not a fan as a kid because I'm older. I was a kid before he was in the business and a fan. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But we have always acknowledged the magnitude of the money that he drew. And the fact that, remember, I said, when we were talking about Flair, I said we were talking about the #1 box office attraction of the year every year in the 90s or in the 80s. I said, well, it would have been Flair if it hadn't been for Hulk. It would have been Flair if it hadn't been for Hulk. Like 7 years in a row or whatever. And I don't know what there's differences between being the biggest box office attraction and the biggest mainstream star. And sometimes you might be able to be both at the same time. But as in terms of biggest box office attraction in wrestling, besides, nobody's ever going to top Jim Londos because that was a completely different generation and everything was different. But since then, who would have been, for a short period of time, Austin and Rock drew more money, but a much shorter period of time.
Locally, Bruno was obviously the biggest thing ever, but we're talking about someone who on a national stage, with some ebb and flow at a certain point in the early 90s, but for 20 years was the biggest drawing card and the most recognizable pro wrestler in the world.
Well, and even Gorgeous George, while he at one point, the name Gorgeous George, then the image of the blonde guy, Gorgeous George, because of the early network TV, more people may have known who he was at a period of time in this country, but he didn't draw the money and it didn't last nearly as long. And I mean, don't let anybody say Cornette said Gorgeous George didn't draw money, but he flopped in New York. But I'm talking about Gorgeous George more became a celebrity because Bob Hope and everybody on television was also talking about him. And it was in Hollywood where they all saw him, and it was all over TV in Los Angeles, as we've talked about.
And it was the early days of TV. There were only a few channels, and wrestling was one of the most watched things on American TV at that time.
So as far as at the gate, and take Londos, and Londos was a bigger mainstream star because people had to read the fucking newspaper every day. There was no television or whatever. But take him out of it, and, it's got to be Hogan. And Bill Longson was a big draw in the 40s when everybody else was in the Army. So that's why I think it for a lot of people, it's been kind of sad. The ones that really liked him and were fans, or probably even the guys that liked him, his friends in the business, probably at some point were rolling their eyes at all the things he was getting into that were, it's ended up like it has, where there's memes of Hogan walking through the pearly gates and there's God and he's black. And it's like, what? Jesus, that's harsh for a guy who never actually fucking went to jail for fucking anybody up or anything.
It's the fact that he said on the tape that, we're all racist, or I'm a racist to a point. Whatever he said, it was a declaration that he never walked back completely. I mean, when he made the big apology to the WWE locker room, and again, a lot of wrestlers.
Well, he did. It wasn't an apology. It was a warning. Don't get caught saying stupid shit.
Be careful on social media was like his message.
Don't let them know what you really think.
So, I mean, that's where, people really lose it for Hogan. There are a lot of fans out there who really, really grew to dislike him because they grew up feeling the opposite way. And then all of a sudden, there's a secret video of him throwing the N-word around, saying things about his daughter dating an African American, and then declaring himself a racist while cheating on his wife or whatever it was with the guy's wife who was filming. I mean, the whole thing.
Well, come on now.
So...
To be fair, with what we've learned about his wife afterwards, wouldn't you been trying to fucking find another goddamn country to live in or something?
Well, the point is, it was all out there, and Hogan, I don't know how big things would have been. Let me rephrase that in English, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know if an apology, a genuine, heartfelt one, would have changed everyone's opinion, but it would have gone a long way, especially amongst people in the wrestling business. Because that's the other thing you started seeing was a lot of, like, let's say the contemporary WWE wrestlers. AEW, remember AEW banned Linda Hogan, and it wasn't like the people there weren't thinking, Hulk Hogan too. They got to a point where the modern generation of wrestlers was offended by him being around.
Well, that's why I mentioned I would have to think that a lot of the guys from his generation that were friends and liked him were rolling their eyes and like, please, Hulkster, give us something to work with, every once in a while, and don't get in some of these deals.
But you mentioned the 80s before and Ric Flair. To me, it's like those are the leaders of that generation, and we just lost one. And again, they've all had a fall from grace in one form or another, but when you look at Hogan, Flair, and Vince, like, to me, those are the three monumental figures.
Jesus Christ, now that you just said that, I'm sorry, but now that you have just said that, and we see 40 years ago, if you had said, well, here's what's going to happen to these three,
yeah, you
it'd have fucking put you in a rubber room, and it's happened.
Yeah. Now, you brought up before, you've only been in a room with Hogan a few times. I'm guessing the first time you was maybe the most impactful. Did you take his very first promo photos?
I can't. I took the very first ones and probably the only ones that were taken in the Memphis territory. But now, here's the thing. They broke him in Florida, as everybody knows. We're not going to, I'm sure you can find another podcast to give you chapter and verse, but we're trying to make this somewhat first-person accounts. They broke him in Florida and in 78, and he worked under a mask down there. So I don't technically know if he'd had any pictures taken of him barefaced because he was the Super Destroyer or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So then they booked him in Alabama. Louis Tillett was the booker at that point in time. And was it Continental?
Not yet.
It wasn't even Continental yet. It was still Southeastern.
It was Southeastern, and it was just when they had opened up the Alabama end because it was in Knoxville, and then Ron Fuller opened up the second part of the territory.
And so it used to be the old Gulf Coast territory and the fields and et cetera. But nevertheless, because it was next door to Florida, so they booked him over there. And about 6 weeks later is when Jared booked him up here. Well, and see, here's the thing. At that point in time, in April, May of 1979, Robert Fuller was still booking Memphis for Jarrett. And he used a lot of the Knoxville crew because it was the other end of the state. But since Knoxville was affiliated with Continental, they heard about this big blonde guy they had down there in Pensacola and said, well, let's bring him up because Lawler was doing a deal. Mongolian Stomper was the Southern heavyweight champion. Lawler was working with him. Gorgeous George Jr. was the Stomper's manager. And so Lawler brings in a mystery wrestler into the Mid-South Coliseum to face the Mongolian Stomper for the title. And it turns out to be Terry Boulder, Terry the Hulk Boulder. And then the next week was a tag team match with Lawler and Hulk against Stomper and Gorgeous George Jr. And they brought him to Louisville, I believe, at the same time for a week or two. And then he went back down to Continental. But I had gotten a couple pictures of him then as the Lawler tag team. And then he came back about 6 weeks later. That's when they brought him in with, well, at that time he was Eddie Boulder because they were supposed the Boulder brothers. But it was Dizzy Hogan, Ed Leslie, et cetera, Brutus Beefcake. And then they were here for a couple months, and I got some more photos there. So most of the pictures that I've seen actually pose stuff rather than in the ring in Knoxville, Southeastern, or Continental, or Southeastern down in Alabama is my stuff. The blue background especially. I think there's a red background. But those are stuff that I did.
What do you remember about him at that point? Obviously, you're just a photographer, and
absolutely nothing. I'm the photographer. He's a big fucking new guy that is photogenic as fuck. So I said, hey, let's get some pictures, and he does the poses. And this is literally on the way to the ring because that's the way I set my shit up so I could catch the guys. They're upstairs getting warmed up. Hey, let's get some pictures. Ding, ding, ding. Off they go. So I didn't have anything to pass the day with him about, right? And he's brand new, doesn't know anybody. So he's got the photographers taking some pictures of him and boom. And that was that.
So you had seen already Superstar Billy Graham and you had seen Austin Idol. Now, two guys who directly influenced Hulk Hogan. Billy Graham influenced everyone, but he stole so much from Austin Idol. He's admitted it too from when they worked together in Atlanta.
Yeah.
He stole so much from Austin Idol. But you had seen them already, and the fans in Memphis had.
Well, now hold on. I hadn't seen Graham yet. Graham came in at the end of 79, but obviously, we were cognizant of Graham, but go ahead.
But you had seen Rocky John. You had seen guys with good physiques there before. How did the fans take to Hogan, just in terms of the look? Because beyond the eventual promo ability, which wasn't there at all yet, beyond the eventual charisma, which may have been barely there yet, it was the look. It was, forget about the shaved belly hair and everything going on.
The mushroom cloud.
Forget about that even. Just the muscles, the look, the beginning of the steroid era for wrestling, where it went from occasionally some guys did it to just about everyone's going to be doing it. How did he stand out in 79 amongst those fans?
Well, and also you remember the video that they did where
Michael St. John,
like Michael St. John from Nashville did the voiceover of the camera shoots the wrestling boots. And then there's I can't do the voiceover from memory from 50 years ago, but he stands 6'7". He weighs 325 pounds, whatever. And the camera pans up and he's in bodybuilding pose lighting, right? Where it's black behind him and the spotlight's on him. And the camera goes all the way up and he hits the fucking Hulk poses and everything. The Hulk is coming. And that was enough to get people's attention. And when they brought him in as Lawler's partner, okay, look at the fuck that was the, reaction from the people. And they put those matches in the main event and they got over with the people that were there. But as you will recall, that was a period of time where, as I mentioned, Robert Fuller was booking, and I got to be Memphis. I didn't know at the time how far down Memphis was, but I knew Louisville was feeling puny. And so it wasn't like that he made a tremendous difference the first couple of weeks he was there when he was Lawler's partner, but the match he got over and the matches got over, they worked around shortcomings. And, he got the bear hug, the super Southern squeeze on the Mongolian Stomper, and he's selling it. People are going crazy, right? And then when they come back, here was the problem. The problem is they came back when Robert Fuller had taken all the Knoxville guys, and we've talked about this.
Pete Austin.
Well, yeah. Well, hold on now. It wasn't the whole problem. There was other problems. But Fuller had taken all the guys back to Knoxville when the guys left to go with the Poffos and run opposition, Garvin, Roop, Orton, etc. The whole thing had shifted. Now Jarrett's got to rebuild the territory. So he shoots the Tupelo concession stand brawl angle, and he puts Wayne Ferris and Larry Latham as the blonde bombers on top. Later, the Honky Tonk Man and Moondog spot. My old partner, Danny Davis, was their manager, Sergeant Danny Davis. And that was the program with Lawler and Dundee. He had Tommy and Eddie Gilbert against Buddy and Ken Wayne. And Ron Bass came in, Outlaw Ron Bass, who's a very talented guy, but never been a big draw in the Tennessee territory since the days of Ron and Don Bass with their manager, Ma Bass, in the early 70s. And that's who Hulk was, Terry the Hulk Boulder was going to work with. And with his brother, Eddie, who was worse than he was, who could not work and could not talk. Hogan was starting to where he was trying to do the, let me tell you something, Jack thing, you know, he was trying that at that point, but he wasn't confident with it, but he could carry it off. But between the hair that Beefcake had, which was just preposterous, remember that long bleached blonde, it just, oh God, he got heat from the guys in the audience. And they couldn't work. And then they had to, and then you mentioned Pete Austin, who's this kid. I don't know where the fuck he went from there, maybe home, but he was like 6'3" and 260 or 70 pounds. And they paired him up with Ron Bass against these guys. And so Hulk won the Southern title from Ron Bass at one point, I think. But I remember that the problem was they were Jarrett was trying to make the people take them as main eventers by booking them in the main event. And back in those days, the main event went on last. And the classic example of how that it didn't work was the night that the WFIA convention, the fans convention, was in town in July of 79, right?
That's the night they got to see the future of wrestling in two different ways. Maybe they didn't realize it. The theme music for the Freebirds and then Hulk Hogan.
Yes, but what stole the show was the past of wrestling. Because the Freebirds worked with Lawler and Dundee, and they did what they did, and people were happy with it, right? And the entrance was cool. You know, no doubt. Me and Brad Hildebrand kneeled down ringside together watching that. And the last match was Terry and Eddie Boulder, the Hulk. They usually wrote the Hulk and Eddie Boulder because that was cooler, but against Ron Bass and Pete Austin with Danny Davis. No, I'm sorry. He wasn't their manager yet. But Ron Bass and Pete Austin in a tag team match. And the match in the middle was Wayne Ferris, Larry Latham, and Danny Davis in a 3-on-2 handicap match against Jackie and Roughhouse Fargo. Jackie Fargo hadn't been in Memphis in 2 years. It'd been 4 for Roughhouse. And they tore the fucking house down, literally. The tables were turned over. Fargo was kicking the legs off that oak table to fucking bash him over the heads with. The fucking Roughhouse went crazy. And after that, here comes Terry and Eddie Boulder against Ron Bass and Pete Austin. And people kind of, there was trickling in the aisles of like, let's beat the traffic. And I mean, it had drawn, there was 7,000 people there that night, which was up from what Fuller had been doing a month, 6 weeks beforehand, but they all came to see the Fargos.
It's the same thing that happened when Zulu was on top with, was it the Stomp?
Yes. Yes.
You said 4 years earlier. Was it 4 years earlier when that happened?
Yes. That was 1975. They sold out 3 weeks in a row, but he wanted to put Jarrett's philosophy was put the Southern heavyweight title match on last. So Stomper and Zulu had 3 straight sellouts with the Fargos underneath. All 3 Fargos that time, Jackie, Don, and Roughhouse. Jackie, Don, and Roughhouse is what I'm trying to say.
Nuthouse, yeah.
Sometimes known as Nut House.
So, I mean, that's Memphis, and he goes from there to Georgia, becomes Sterling Golden. No one's surprised to hear that he was a favorite of Jim Barnett's. And
nope. And now wait a minute. Remember, at that time, let's back up a second, because when he was working in the Alabama end of Southeastern, when he was first coming up for Jarrett, that's when they did the angle with him and Andre the first time. The arm wrestling where they turned the table over and blah, blah, blah. And because they had dates on Andre in Southeastern. So not only by the time that Hogan went to work in Atlanta for Barnett in late 79, early 80, that's when Barnett was annexing Knoxville. Ron Fuller said, well, fuck, these guys have fucked up my whole territory. And so they started using the Georgia talent. So Hogan and Andre had some matches, not only in Alabama when he first got started, a handful, couple, whatever, but they sold out Dothan one night, which was unheard of. But also they worked with each other in Knoxville before they'd even worked with each other in Atlanta, or then later on in the Superdome and,
yeah,
the big shows around the country, Shea Stadium.
Yeah, that's what's crazy. If you look at the show you just talked about in Memphis, the summer of 79, 1 year later, Hogan and Andre do the Superdome for JYD versus Michael Hayes as an attraction brought in by Watts. And then the Shea Stadium show, which, I mean, it's really incredible, 1 year after that Memphis show, how many big crowds, not just Hogan, but the Hogan-Andre package was in front of.
Well, and see, think about this, by 1981, he's already had, a run in New York, or is in the middle of his run in New York. And a matter of fact, saw him in 1981 when I was in Memphis when he came in the one shot to work with Lawler, when Jimmy Hart was bringing in all of Lawler's old nemesises and nemesi to face him, and he came and did that one shot.
They would always show that footage, and because Lawler didn't pin him, they would never show the finish.
Yes. It would, and a DQ was flat at that point, but then Lawler got a hold of Jimmy Hart and people went crazy and blah, blah, blah. But nevertheless, in those 2 years, he had gotten confidence because he was a smart guy, especially when it came to what was getting him over, what was best for him. He picked that up quick because he worked with all those top guys in that first 2 years, was exposed to all. He was partners with Jerry Lawler. They have to learn something, even for 3 weeks.
He worked with Harley, I think, in 79, didn't he?
Well, but then he's in the ring with Andre, and he's working for Jerry Jarrett, who he, always kind of acknowledged that was a big help to him. But he's working in Atlanta around Jim Barnett, even if they did name him Sterling Golden. And then Vince Sr. And in the ring with, the talent up there. So he was able to pick up. He was never going to be Flair as far as a in-ring performer, but for a guy that size that looked like that, he was able to pick things up quickly on how to either be a heel or later on how to be a babyface. And I mean, hulking up, if he'd have been wearing a strap, he'd have been a Lawler dropping a strap.
Yeah, see, there's always been debate about where Hogan picked up certain things. Like, it's obvious that Hulkamania was because of his exposure to Idolmania, when Austin Idol was doing that in Georgia. The superstar Billy Graham style promos, calling everyone brother, this and that, you can kind of see that. The hulking up, you've heard people say was Lawler. You've heard some people say it was the Crusher.
Well, it could have been any babyface, because see, that's the thing. It's not like Lawler invented that concept either. All babyfaces, pretty much in the last 50, 70 years, TV era, whatever, of wrestling, they had some movement or reaction that would indicate to the fans they've had all they can stands and they can't stands no more, and something might be about to happen. That's a very wide description. But again, this is where, and it's some Dusty too, when he was a babyface in Florida.
Yeah, I was going to say Dusty.
When he'd start wagging that finger, right? And Hogan's watching that, and he's partners with a guy that fucking gets pickled and fucking straightens up and turns away. But of course, he didn't do anything like Lawler did, in my opinion, but the same principle. But all of that was osmosis in those 2 years. And then he goes to Japan and he's in a different situation there, but he commands huge money because look at the fuck that. Over there, he's a giant American.
Well, part of the story started happening in Japan. No, I mean, the biggest example is certainly Minneapolis, the AWA. The fans turned him. The fans started accepting him. And again, he stood out in that era when you first started really seeing the physiques. Kerry Von Erich wasn't as physically imposing in 81 as he would be in 84. Like, it was just the beginning of that era. And Hogan went everywhere the first time as a heel. And the fans started really liking him. And he kind of, again, it's an era changing. Obviously the movie, and we'll get to that in a little bit, was a big deal. But Vince brings him in, Vince Sr., gives him the name Hogan. Eventually, the Hulk thing would cause a problem at Marvel Comics because they own the rights to the Hulk. And they would, remember, back then he was the Incredible Hulk Hogan once he started getting going.
Yes, later he became immortal, but he was incredible.
Well, literally, they weren't legally allowed to call him the Incredible Hulk Hogan, and Marvel Comics got a percentage of all sorts of things throughout the Hulkamania era. It's pretty incredible. But he goes up there. Do you remember who was the president of the Hulk Hogan fan club?
Oh my God. Wasn't it Mike?
Yes.
Help me.
Mike O'Hara.
Mike O'Hara.
O'Hara was.
Sorry, Mike.
He told me that he was on 605 once and he had a problem a few years later because he was doing this fan club. And he says he was one of the people that right after the 79 WFIA convention brought photos of Hulk Hogan to the office. A lot of people have said that they had, submitted photos of Hogan and recommended him. He says he did it. And he was interviewing Hogan's parents. It was a real fan club. WWE sent him legal notices to shut it down, and he just kept responding. Ask Hulk Hogan. Ask Hogan. He knows who I am and what I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, as a matter of fact, Mike O'Hara, he's in the picture of all of us from that convention when we were wearing our wrestling T-shirts. It's been Twitterfied here lately. But yes, he was at the Memphis show that night and the TV that weekend when he took some of the pictures, same as I did. Mine were still earlier because I caught him on the first run, but that was summer of 79, as Brian Adams would say.
And they bring him in and they give him Fred Blassie as a manager. And, a couple different looks. He had the leotard for a while. He had the chest hair for a while. He wore blue. I mean, they were really...
He wore blue.
No, I mean, they were trying to figure out who
was
and
it
what.
Blue velvet?
The rumor always was, I don't know how true it was, that Vince McMahon Sr. wanted him to dye his hair red. I think that's a Hulk Hogan story.
No.
You've heard that, right? You heard Hogan say that?
Yeah, well, yes, and no. No, and it's not even... I don't know where the idea was that Vince Sr. specifically wanted him to be an Irish heel or Irish person or whatever has come from. If that was Hulk also, if somebody's corroborated it, then I'll back off on this. But he had already been using Hulk, but I guarantee you Vince Sr. as well as Vince Jr. wouldn't have liked Hulk Boulder, Terry the Hulk Boulder, Sterling Golden, blah. They like alliteration. Hulk Hogan, because Hogan's a good fucking name. But wasn't going to be carrying a shillelagh with red hair or whatever the fuck. And also look at the way, again, that he was dressing. He was trying different colors, and he had the old heel cape that he had. There wasn't like a long Batman cape. It's like a short fucking Audrey Hepburn cape or whatever. None of that screamed Irish, did it? It was an alliterative name that looked good on the marquee. And here's the Hulk Hogan, and you can hear him as a heel. I can see Vince Sr. acting it out, or Vince Jr. acting it out if he was envisioning the name as a heel name, and his name's Hulk Hogan. And he's huge. So I think that was probably the depth of that. They did not know they were naming the future all-time biggest fucking draw they ever had right then. See? I'm sorry. I don't mean to get upset. But it's just when everybody tries to all this deep meaning into these things.
Well, Hogan's up there. He has Freddie Blassie. They do the program with him and Andre. Hogan never gets any matches with Backlund, the champion, at the Garden. Gets some matches in other locations, which were big deals, but it wasn't the Garden. It is something there in terms of the way they're protecting him. Eventually he leaves, does jobs on the way out, and then he goes to film Rocky 3, and that's really, not just for Hulk Hogan, but in a lot of ways for the wrestling industry, that's one of the biggest things that ever happened.
Well, yeah, because, and obviously, I saw Rocky 3 in theaters when it first came out, not just because there was a wrestler in it, but because you went to see all the goddamn Rocky movies at that point in time. But that opened up the door to every talk show because he was just so visually impressive. And it came off like it was one of the highlight scenes of the movie and what everybody was talking about. And then he looks so good, not only when he does the talk shows or the publicity, but by now, this is 4 years around all these people kind of contributing to telling him how to fucking get over. And he's smart, as I said, and he's learned it. Now he can go and bullshit the main. Oh, yes. And that was publicity that most wrestlers didn't get in those days, because even if they were drawing the same kind of crowds, they didn't look like that. And they didn't have that visibility from being in a movie that would lead to those doors. And then, to be honest with you, a lot of them wouldn't have been able to, capitalize on it. They wouldn't have had the bullshit.
And once that movie came out, it was impossible for him to be a heel because it was such a big deal. And it may have been, and for some people, it was one of the highlights of the movie. And he was a heel in the movie, but he just blew up. But
remember then, Vern Gagne, when he brought him in, he was a heel, and his manager was luscious Johnny Valiant.
That's right.
And the people shit on Johnny Valiant. I was in the business by that point, and Bockwinkel, as a matter of fact, was coming down to Memphis in '83. I'm pretty sure that's, but because I'd always been a big fan of the Valiant brothers, but it didn't work. And people were cheering him anyway, but they were ignoring Johnny Valiant. And I'm sure the baby faces were like, what the fuck? Don't book me with this fucking guy. You bury me. I don't know what to fucking do.
When I was younger and I would see footage of Johnny Valiant as a manager, like throughout the 80s, that was one of those moments where I would say, one day I'll be an adult and these promos will make sense. And they still make no sense. I have no idea what he's saying, why he's saying it, or what it's about.
See, here's the thing. Just as a side note here, and then we'll move on. The Valiant brothers worked because Jimmy was the Valiant brother and Johnny played off Jimmy. And Johnny was just saying a lot of those incomprehensible things in between Jimmy taking breaths. And remember how the Chain Gang, remember Don Fargo and when they were the Dillinger and Frank? Yeah. Frank Dillinger, when they did those promos in Indianapolis, it kind of worked as long as Jimmy was there. But when Johnny was talking on his own, he was just still doing the shit that he used to do in between the guy that was talking to you for real.
When it was Johnny and Jerry, you're like, oh, I hope Lou Albano speaks up here.
Yes, and someone needs to stop this. But nevertheless, back to
82.
Back to 82. So now Hogan's making a tremendous amount of money to begin with, 82, 83, he's in the AWA, he's in goddamn Japan, the high-profile matches, the stuff with Inoki, and he's probably already one of the highest-paid guys because they're selling out in Minneapolis.
And it was the biggest business they ever did in AWA history, 82, 83. All on the back of, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of it on the back of Hulk Hogan. It really was a package in a lot of ways, but Hulk Hogan was the one who really boosted things. He started, I don't know when he started making $10,000 a week in Japan, in 83, but think about how much money that is. He was making that much money in 83 and then flying to Minnesota where they already had a light schedule. I mean, he was really living the life at that point.
Well, yeah, that's why Bockwinkel stayed in Minnesota for 15 years, well, 20 years, whatever it was, because they only worked 15 days a month and they were mostly big towns.
And around this period of time, he had started dating Linda, the future Linda Hogan. She was from Southern California, but I believe she moved with him to Minneapolis after he proposed to her or whatever it was. So, I mean, everything is kind of coming together. The AWA is obviously feeling like everything's great. And right around this same period of time, Vince McMahon Jr., a lot of people didn't realize he was already in charge. He'd already bought the company, starts making his moves. And, we've talked about it a lot in the past. The options. Who's going to be the guy to go national with? You need a guy. Is it going to be Backlund? No way. Snuka had just killed his girlfriend and before that had beat her up and beat up a bunch of dogs and cops in a hotel.
Probably a disqualifier.
Probably
right
a disqualifier. Vince has said himself recently in his documentary, and years ago he told Brian Solomon in an interview he conducted in like 2003 or 4, whatever it was Dusty. If it wasn't going to be Hogan, it wouldn't have been Kerry Von Erich. Couldn't get Kerry Von Erich, to be honest with you. It was going to be Dusty. Dusty also had a lot of options on the table. He would go book for Jim Crockett a year later. He was already a touring attraction outside of the Florida territory. But Hogan, if you look at the way the decade would proceed and the things that would happen and the look, Hogan was certainly the right guy for Vince McMahon Jr. at that time.
Oh, yeah.
And he knew it. And while working for the AWA is when he sent Steve Taylor to make his move.
Well, and
the photographer,
it was
Steve Taylor.
I was outside that. It might have been Steve Taylor, the plumber. Steve Taylor may have done some plumbing before he became a photographer. But here's the thing. It was always going to be somebody first and foremost that could talk. Because with Vince Jr., because I know somebody's going, oh, well, Jesus Christ, Dusty Rhodes didn't look anything like Hulk. Well, Vince has said that in the interviews that you mentioned, but also it's common sense that Vince went for the charismatic, for the package of charisma. Can this guy, Dusty Rhodes was at that time one of the top, certainly 2 or 3 or 4 box office attractions. I don't know who was bopping around right at that point in time. But he could talk, even though he looked nothing like Hulk. But you know that Hulk being able to talk not as well as Dusty at that point and probably ever, on any kind of consistent basis, but the look was more what Vince was, even at that point in time, Vince was fancying himself somewhat of a physical fitness freak. And so that was because we wanted superstar Billy Graham, but Billy Graham was too old and had broken down. So, but that was the thing, is if there hadn't been a Hogan, there wasn't really a lot of other choices for a charismatic guy that could talk people in, unless you were going for Dusty. Maybe at that point, Austin Idol would have said, excuse me, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm over here.
This money smells nice.
And I've got the gym membership. But anyway.
But it's a remarkable series of events that happened at the end of '83. Right before Starrcade, which Hogan was originally supposed to be on, or at least he was billed as being on. He was in the program.
He was in the program. I've got it.
Well, right before that, Vince and Hogan already have their deal. Hogan's going to Japan. Still is billed for a bunch of shows with the AWA throughout Christmas and into early '84. Vince has a dinner, apparently him and his wife, and Harley Race and his wife. I don't know if Harley's wife was there. It was at least Vince and Linda with Harley. Which leads to a
I have a feeling if Harley's wife at the time was there, she would have double-legged Vince. But
well, apparently Vince McMahon in the bathroom after Harley Race turned him down. He wanted Harley Race to jump to the WWF with the NWA title and lose to the WWF champion, whoever it may be. Harley refused, didn't want to hurt the NWA, possibly even more, didn't want to hurt Ric Flair. But he also owned a piece of the Kansas City office. Vince McMahon allegedly tried to take him down in the bathroom.
Well, hold on, because it would not only have been Harley just double crossing one person or one company or whatever. As the champion, he'd known all these people for so many years. His word had always been good. He had a piece of one company while he was the entire alliance's champion. So he looked at Vince and they were in the bathroom, as you said. He says, "See that mirror?" He said, "I got to look at that face every morning when I get up in the mirror," and turned him down that way. Just no. And as he's walking out, he says, and truthfully, I don't see Harley being much of a fucking fabricator. Said that Vince tried to double leg him and fucking take him down. He said, "What the fuck are you doing?" And that didn't end, it ended quickly. But Vince's feelings were spurned.
Because he wanted to kill the NWA. That was his chance to kill the NWA, and he had already made his move to kill the AWA. He had Hogan. Vern Gagne didn't know. Vern Gagne ends up getting a telegram from Hogan, "I'm not coming back," while he's in Japan. Again, Christmas shows coming up. These were big shows they had after the biggest year they ever had. You could say, in a sense, Hulk Hogan was the first person to really take Vince McMahon seriously. Because Vince McMahon, when he hit him up and said, "I'll make you $1 million, you'll be the first wrestler to make $1 million a year. I'm going to merchandise the hell out of you." Hogan could have said, "Well, this guy's not done that for anyone ever. Can he really do it for me? This was the announcer. This was Vince's son when I was there."
Well, but hold on now, because you phrase it a different way. Hogan believed in Vince, but not the first one to take him seriously. Harley took the offer seriously. He just didn't want to take it. And I think while a lot of people laughed at Vince that he was going to take over the world, at the same point, a lot of people in the business knew that the guy that owned the largest grossing territory already in the business, because he had New York and Boston and Philadelphia and Baltimore, he can pay me more money probably than where I'm working now. I will take this guy seriously, but potentially not seriously enough to stab my business partners in the back or whatever in some of those type of deals. But yeah, a lot of people took Vince seriously as being able to pay them. They did. I don't think many of them believed he was going to take over the goddamn wrestling world in the next 10 years or whatever, but they knew he could pay them a wonderful amount for a short period of time. And there were no contracts at that point in time. So nobody was looking for, "Oh, he'll bring me in to sign me up and I'll be set for 3 years with a big guarantee." That didn't exist. But Hogan, think about this. He knows what he's done in the Midwest. And if you can draw 18,000 people in Minneapolis, St. Paul, if the goddamn promoter of Madison Square Garden is pushing you hard, where all the networks are located, where all the fucking media comes out of, where your main event in Madison Square Garden, if you can sell that son of a bitch out, then you get to be a movie star, which happened. I'm not talking about getting a part in a Stallone movie. I'm talking about being the star of the movie. He knew he would have gone with Vince anyway, because that was the key to being the better to get a chance as the top pushed guy in Madison Square Garden than to never appear in the garden at all, right? So it wasn't, I don't even think that Hogan would have ever dreamed what was going to happen had happened, but he knew that was a fucking dream spot. Worked well for Bruno. And if Vince hadn't expanded nationally, he still had, and Hogan could have worked goddamn any number of days he wanted to work for crowds of 5, 10,000, 15, 20,000 a night. So it wasn't like it was a goddamn gamble.
And it was the big change in a lot of ways that would happen to the wrestling industry around the back of Hulk Hogan in terms of merchandising. There'd always been t-shirts, there'd always been magazines, programs, different things. But on the back of Hogan, because he looked like a superhero or an action figure in the era of He-Man had just come out a couple years before that. Hogan, before they even got to the figure deal, t-shirts, bandanas, calendar, the yellow fingers, which were kind of, ubiquitous throughout that era. The yellow finger in the air for Hulk Hogan. Lots of other wrestlers were in the line of LJN wrestling superstars and had t-shirts, but it was the Hulkamania shirt was everywhere. I knew someone years ago. It was a family member. He was wearing a Hulkamania shirt. I said, where'd you get that? Oh, it was my girlfriend's. What? Like, who's she? How did she have it? It was just something in the culture. And eventually those figures come out. And, again, there were lots of stars and there were lots of people merchandise, but he was the big one. And it even starts before Vince. That was the other interesting thing because of Rocky III. There were Hogan puppets. There were Hogan figures. There were all these things. And then the cartoon hits. And it was a perfect storm of merchandising and of pop culture sensibility breaking out. And then chokes out Richard Belzer, hosts Saturday Night Live, all over MTV, comes out to Eye of the Tiger before Survivor shut that down. All these things happening. And it was kind of, if you look at any Hogan stuff from 84 and 85, it feels right for that era. I know I'm saying this to you and you were doing other things in 84 and 85.
Well, no, I know what you mean. I acknowledge it. And truthfully, that was when, for me, wrestling began its descent into entertainment madness, but you can't deny the money that was made and the popularity. And at that point, for a while, the rising tide did lift all the boats because the hotter that one got, the hotter the other would get. And it was somewhat legitimate competition, which happened only from 85 to 88 and 97 to 99 and in that whole fucking schmear.
Yeah. And then Vince goes into Minnesota. He has Hogan against the AWA. AWA still remained pretty hot throughout 84 into 85. They had the Road Warriors come in. They still had a lot of big stuff happening, but all of a sudden Hogan and Mean Gene are in the main event. I mean, that was a big deal, and Hogan was the big deal for the WWF in California. That was when they started their California push in 83, but they got Hogan in 84.
Well, I can tell you that, especially in the Southeast, and Bo James had just tweeted earlier, I saw that in the Tri-Cities area and the East Tennessee area, they came in a couple shows with Hogan sold out Freedom Hall in Johnson City. If Hogan then wasn't on the card after that, it was, 500 people. They did well in Louisville here when I think it was 85, I think, by the time they got here. But with Hogan, they'd draw a crowd. Otherwise, nobody gave a shit. And, with the established Southern territories, they couldn't really draw. Same thing with Mid-South or the Dallas territory or whatever. If Hogan was there, it was a success, but otherwise they weren't going to go see the non-local wrestling.
I mean, he was a name that broke out beyond wrestling fans. A casual person would know who Hulk Hogan was because of all the attention over a few years there. The same way like the word WrestleMania. I used to hear, especially in the 80s, people would use that word like, oh, are they going to have a WrestleMania? They would say that for a house show. It was like things that were getting introduced into the culture and was really blowing up. Not to go too far ahead, you brought up the movies before. No Holds Barred came out when I was 9 in 1989. I had just become a big wrestling fan. I went with my neighbor to see it. Both of our parents refused to go. So it was the first movie I got dropped off for. Like, my parents and his parents both said, we're not sitting through this movie. And they were right. It was the first movie in my life I saw, and I'm like, this is bad. I realized Hulk Hogan was a terrible actor in that movie. He would get better. He was certainly better actually as an actor on wrestling than in movies, but that movie was atrocious, and that was the focus of the WWF in the summer of 89.
Well, nevertheless, everybody knows, I think we can assume that everyone listening knows what happened in the 80s and then the 90s.
Where were you when WrestleMania 3 happened? When did you first see it?
You've asked me this before, and I can't remember what answer I gave you, except it's not like I bought the pay-per-view. I believe I was somewhere that day, but obviously we heard about it and the crowd and et cetera, but I would have to think it was probably a few weeks later, whenever Norman Dooley might have sent me the VHS tape. But, that's the thing is we recognized, okay, We've got all this great television. We're selling out these other places. And I'm talking about Crockett. We're selling out all these places. We've got this great television. The talent roster up and down is comparable. And look at the difference in the in-ring. Ours is superior. But Jesus Christ, they're getting these people on network television. They're getting these people on a Tonight Show. They're getting these people they're putting them in stadiums. It was somewhat demoralizing, but we recognize that, my God, we can't compete with, they're on NBC once every Saturday or once a month on Saturday night. It's like, I didn't realize that we were going to get bought out by people with all the money in the world instead of poor old little Jimmy Crockett and then fucking it all go to shit. I thought it would go to shit while we were with Jimmy Crockett, but sooner or later something was going to go to shit.
Of course, we bring up Andre, and we talked a lot about it. I'm sure everyone's talking about everything with WrestleMania 3, which to me, to this day, is still like the biggest event. I still mark out watching that video, the entirety of that card, every bad match and all. I love that whole show. But then they did the thing with him and Savage, which was a pretty long build. They become friends. Savage becomes a babyface. The Mega Powers form. Savage wins the world title. Hogan disappears to make his movie. And then the big turn, or series of events that led to it, on Saturday night's main event again, your former protege, Big Bubba, the Big Boss Man, and Akeem, managed by Slick against the Mega Powers, and they have this big breakup. It's pretty embarrassing how it happened live, where they didn't get the right time cue, and Brutus Beefcake.
That's where he's supposed to be praying over Elizabeth's near dead carcass, and he looks up on NBC television and says, "Give me a count." Something of that nature.
That's right.
Count me in, brother.
But it led to what was, for a long time, the biggest pay-per-view ever. WrestleMania 5, Atlantic City. 700-something thousand pay-per-view buys. And he beats Randy Savage, but it begins just a long trend of him crushing Randy Savage. He kicks out of the elbow and then just immediately beats him. But that seemed to be a pattern. And, I guess you got to kind of have to mention a little bit of the Randy Savage, Hulk Hogan relationship, frenemy, friends at times. It would end up being a big part of the story, from what happened with the Eye at WrestleMania 9 to them working together, again in WCW, to, Hogan's always said that he ran into Savage at the doctor's office right before Randy Savage died and they made up. But it ends up becoming a pretty big relationship, a pretty big friendship at times in the life and career of Hogan, the Randy Savage one.
Well, and that was like, what years? 88, 89?
88, they team up. 89, they're feuding.
Okay, yeah. Even when I got there in 93, Bruce used to hold that up to me as an example of Vince's long-term booking, how he liked to go a year out and then work backwards. And we planted seeds, and it was months later that all this stuff and everything. And my thing to him was, where'd that fucking guy go? He's changing shit we did 2 weeks ago.
That's right.
But they did, plot that thing out so carefully. And it's two dynamic personalities. We talked about Savage not long ago. Even though he was smaller in stature than Hogan, he had the fucking physique, but he had the intensity. And you believe that guy is a nut. And it was the very modern version of Mad Dog Vachon, only being 5'6", but really, being somebody that would bite your fucking face off. And so they bought that, and Savage he was the equal, at least, of Hogan at promos, if not better. But Vince always favored guys with the personalities that could talk and with the charisma. And then the bodies didn't hurt in Vince's eyes, because that was one of his personal interests, to take that statement as you might want to.
And it's right after this period of time, in my opinion, as someone who lived through it, that you start to see the crinkles of the fans, some fans having changing opinions of Hogan. The Ultimate Warrior, for me and all my friends, became way more popular than Hulk Hogan in '89 when he was doing stuff with Zeus. Ultimate Warrior was feuding with the Heenan family. It was a lot better. Then they have the match. Warrior wins. Even as a kid, it felt like this is the start of a whole new thing. They changed the intro to Superstars where it was like a weird time travel through rocks, and there's the Ultimate Warrior at the end with lasers coming out of his eye. Like, it was just, they made it all about him. But Hogan came right back, and he did the feud with Earthquake, where Earthquake injured him, and then they had the match at SummerSlam where they had Rick Rude versus the Ultimate Warrior in a cage. And I think the Warrior took Hogan's popularity down a little bit, and then the Slaughter Hogan thing. You know, I've said this before. There was something there to be done. It didn't need to involve anything with the Iraq War. If Sergeant Slaughter, who to kids like me was a major babyface, not from wrestling, but from G.I. Joe. He was all over that show, his action figures, the G.I. Joe movie.
If he had been the heel Sergeant Slaughter that he was in Mid-Atlantic Wrestling without any of the Iraqi connection or hoo-ha against Hulk Hogan as the biggest star of this company 10 years ago, and this, you know, fucking nationally recognized figure versus Hulk Hogan, it couldn't have drawn any worse than what they did, right?
Right. See, I think they should have brought him back as a babyface because that's what everyone of that generation knew him as at that point for the last 6 years, let's say. And have him turn on Hogan. You know, the guy who comes out to I'm a Real American gets turned on by Sergeant Slaughter. Who's the real American? Instead, it became the Iraq War thing, which beyond the tastelessness of it that everyone had a problem with at the time, the war ended in 2 minutes. So there was no war. And
well, but backing up also, you made an interesting point with Warrior, and because you were the target group at that point in time, Vince Sr. never liked to do babyface matches. He did Bruno and Pedro. I think he might have been talked into it.
72.
And it didn't draw. It rained at Shea Stadium, and he didn't want to do it again. He actually refused Bruno offering to work with Andre flat out because he didn't want to hurt either one of them, because they were long-term attractions for him. For the sake of one giant gate, he didn't want to do that. With Vince, and I think Vince thought that he could just build another superhero that would vanquish the previous superhero and then have Hogan hang around in the Bruno living legend status type of category, because he didn't learn the lesson possibly of his father. But that's the point, is Hogan's first chip in popularity was when they did the big match with the other big babyface. Even though Warrior wasn't as good, wouldn't last as long, at that point, that was the peak of his popularity, and it naturally shifted some people away from Hogan. It just had to.
Yeah, and, you know, if you look at Hogan in 84 or 85, and then you look at Hogan in 90 or 91, he's always been a cartoon, but he came to be more of a cartoonish version of himself, speaking to little kids and everything, as opposed to, you know, this wacky, charismatic guy who, you know, the fans who got into him in Minnesota wasn't just little kids, it was everyone.
He was more condescendingly going through the Hulk Hogan motions than actually making the shit up for the first time as he went along.
Yeah. So the Hulk Hogan who did record business with Paul Orndorff was a very different Hogan from the Hulk Hogan working with Sergeant Slaughter in 91, or, you know, again, another chink in the armor was SummerSlam 91. It's Slaughter and Adnan and Colonel Mustafa, the Iron Sheik, versus the Ultimate Warrior and Hogan with Sid Justice as the referee.
Jesus Christ, there's some ring wizards in that combination there. Poor Slaughter.
Warrior gets fired by Vince. We don't see him again until WrestleMania the next year. And they start building Sid. And then they do the Royal Rumble in January, the one that Ric Flair won, maybe the greatest Royal Rumble ever. And Hulk Hogan pulls Sid Vicious out after he's eliminated. Sid Justice out after he's eliminated. WWF later redubbed the audio so the fans were cheering Hogan. The fans started booing Hogan. And he disappeared right after that, after WrestleMania. Of course, this is when the steroid scandal and the Arsenio Hall scandal and the Zaharian scandal and the Ring Boy thing wouldn't really involve Hogan, but a lot of bad things were happening and getting into the newspapers. And Hogan, right after WrestleMania, right after the return of the Ultimate Warrior, Hogan's gone. But right at that point, you started seeing more WWF fans than ever before not cheer him, cheer someone else. And then when he returns a year later in 93 at the start of Raw, he's much skinnier, doesn't have the same appeal. And although Bret Hart and the beginning of the new generation guys weren't really drawing, nothing was drawing, but they weren't really drawing, the fans, in a lot of respects, did not want another Hogan run then. And it felt forced, and it didn't really take. I know some fans loved him and thought it was great, but it was like a completely different vibe than everything else happening in the company.
Well, he looked different also at that point, and he was trying to get more movie roles, so he wasn't, for whatever reason, all the big guys feel like they have to, even The Rock had to lose weight at one point to go to Hollywood.
And this is this is maybe 6 months, a year before Thunder in Paradise started filming too.
Yeah, but it was getting old. It was getting stale. It was a little cartoony. Everything was getting stale in wrestling. But remember, when Flair went in 91, I was talking to him before he had made the decision. I said, Rick Rubin will give you $10,000 a month. Just make one show a month for us in Smoky Mountain.
I saw them. I saw them at the Garden, Flair and Hogan.
Well, that's the thing. Once that he got up there and started working with Hogan, we know that didn't pan out well. They regardless of what you think about the booking, and they didn't get a WrestleMania match, etc. But what that did was actually start a little bit more chinking at Hogan.
That's right.
Because a lot of guys were Flair guys, and even the people not from the Carolina Territory or Crockett Strong towns, they might have been watching TBS in Butte, Montana. But if they'd go to Butte and have 5,000 people, if there was 400 or 500 that have been watching TV that thought Ric Flair was the coolest thing they ever saw and they never got to see him, they're cheering Flair when he's working with Hogan, right?
Yeah, I saw them. I want to say it was November 91 at the Garden. And it was the most amount of fans I've seen there that weren't Hogan fans. Not that there weren't a ton of Hogan fans. I'm not trying to say that there weren't. There were plenty of Hogan fans. But when Ric Flair, with Mr. Perfect as his second, got a false finish win over Hogan, there were a lot of people like me, I was 11, who jumped up out of their seats cheering. Because it's one of those moments where you're cheering the heel, technically, and you're looking around, other people are looking at you like you've got something wrong with you. But you realize there's a whole lot of us, and we're all really happy that Ric Flair won here.
Well, and it's for people thinking, oh, bullshit now, you're just taking up for Flair. Imagine in 1991, the response, if they'd have booked Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair in the Omni for WCW, that probably would have drawn a fucking house too. But a lot of people would have been cheering for, each guy, because it would draw two heretofore separate audiences. With the way WCW had been doing, not a lot of people were going to the live events, but there were still people watching on television, and historically Ric Flair had been the big star. Yeah. But if you reversed the procedure and brought Hogan over, he would have brought a bunch of people, and even if he was the heel, he would have brought a bunch of people with him. That was the point, is in a 4 or 5 year period there, besides the fact that Hogan is somewhat distracted and is kind of stale, and like we said, for all the reasons why he didn't seem like the fresh thing, he's worked with the Warrior, and he's worked with Ric Flair, and he's worked with people that are chipping away at, where they're saying, yeah, we like the other guy.
Well, yeah, and again, in 91, that version of Hulk Hogan was really geared towards kids. Kids weren't his only fans, but it was geared towards kids. Ric Flair comes in as the real world champion, and his whole fucking gimmick is, I'm going to come to your town and I'm going to out drink and out fuck everyone in your town.
Yeah.
He was the babyface to a lot of us. I'm sorry, he was. He was a lot cooler in 91, 92 than Hogan. They should have done a WrestleMania match. I love Ric Flair and Randy Savage at WrestleMania 8, but it should have been Hogan and Flair. You know, I always wondered, because it drew for them in that time. Was it just because Hogan wouldn't be the complete babyface? Was it that Vince didn't believe in Ric Flair? But for whatever reason,
Vince couldn't fully do an outsider angle and put somebody on the level. And also, he did the same thing with Vader, in that he insisted on putting guys together in house shows all over the country where the most ardent fans had seen it before they would meet on pay-per-view. And it was a whole different time then. We can go down that rabbit hole. But the point being is that I think at that point in time, you know, like you said, Flair was just, to some other people, was a little fresher, especially on a national stage. But Hogan was drooping and all that. The point I was going to make was, in any other situation or era in wrestling or with other personalities, the booker would have just switched him heel. But you almost couldn't do that, and or he wouldn't have done it, because what was it, 4 years later or 3 years later or whatever, he had to be talked into it. So it was better he went away and people started to miss him.
But, you know, he came back before people missed him too much in 93. And again, that was only a short period of time. You came in right after that match with Yokozuna at King of the Ring with that weird finish with the photographer and the Flash. And that's the last time we see Hogan on TV for a while, or for WWF TV especially.
Well, and then again, there's where he screwed Bret Hart. That was supposed to be Bret Hart's whole deal. And I mean, we're not spreading bad stories about Hulk Hogan. This has been publicly accepted fact that he said, no, Bret's not going to be the champion. I'll do this and that, and with Yoko, and a boom.
And then right after that, because he was doing New Japan stuff, I think maybe he worked with Muda in 93. I got to go back and look. But he does an interview on New Japan TV, and he says the WWF title is just a toy. This is the real belt I want, the IWGP. And then allegedly they called him on it in the office, and he denied that it ever happened. It was on video. The video was out there.
And but it didn't happen because it was in Japan.
It was on one of those missing days that happen when you travel back and forth.
Yes, that day didn't exist.
But then Thunder in Paradise becomes his post-wrestling project, and it gets a lot of stations. It's a syndicated show. And while making that show, Ric Flair, I guess Eric Bischoff goes to Ric Flair, and Ric Flair says he can get him to Hogan. And Ric Flair links the two up, and that changes the history of WCW there. Hulk Hogan gets one of the most lucrative deals for any wrestler ever. And he's the biggest star to sign with WCW, and it takes a while. The pay-per-views recover, but it takes the NWO angle and the heel turn to change everything.
Well, yeah, because we were laughing at first because with the contract that they signed, the fanfare, they brought him in as the big baby face, the savior of wrestling. And we used to joke at that point that they lose money. And I think they were, when we saw the numbers broken down, they would lose money on every Hulk Hogan t-shirt they sold by the time they paid to have it made, and they paid somebody to sell it, and they fucking did whatever the fuck and then give him the cut. It was costing them money. And the people didn't really want to see him as the big baby face. And it didn't really spark their business. But as you said, once that the right angle came along that he was the perfect person for, that was a different story, because Nash and Hall were always going to draw in that initial run, because the people really believed that they were WWF guys coming to fuck with the WCW guys. But because Hogan then turned and got all the extra attention and it clicked, that's what kicked the whole thing off. But and also they were WWF icons. It still looked like a promotion versus promotion thing that was the only thing at that point in time that people still really fucking believed was real.
it becomes the hottest thing. It changes WCW's business. But look at 1 year earlier. Hogan, as corny and cartoony as he got in the end of his WWF run, it was all the way hammed up in WCW while he's feuding with the Dungeon of Doom. That famous segment.
I forgot about that.
That famous segment where he walks in, and I remember what he says. He touches the water. It's not hot. There are no Hulkamaniacs here. Who are you? Who are you? It's the most ridiculous acting. And a lot of it was apparently Kevin Sullivan as a booker trying to get Hogan's trust. Trust me, I'm not going to do anything to mess up your character. Let's do some interesting things. They had to first do all that. Of course, the Zodiac, Brother Brutus, Brother Brudi would be a part of the Dungeon of Doom,
or Broody,
or whatever he was. All this is going on. Jimmy Hart's there. A lot of people Hulk Hogan's comfortable with are in WCW. Gene Okerlund comes in 93. Bobby Heenan. Randy Savage comes in after him. They get Elizabeth back at the beginning of Nitro. Nitro starts in the, September 95. It was a very interesting period of time. And then Hogan, who allegedly did not want to turn heel, was finally... They were trying to talk him into it. He said no. And then he finally saw how big it was going to get, or it was.
Yeah.
And he realized, I need to take advantage of this moment. And he did. And it worked.
See, that's the thing. He was smart to get himself into things at the proper times. And, I can see with his success that he had, him thinking, I can never be a heel again. But at the same time, when he was seeing possibly the lack of success he was having compared to the success he'd had, he said, and these guys are hot and they're a little younger and they're fresher and this could be a thing. And then boom, and on and on. Then my personality will still overshadow everybody else. So look at me. But it worked.
And again, he had a killer deal. I have here someone in the Cult of Cornette group posted this earlier. This is the first page of the letter of agreement from 98. Between WCW and Hulk Hogan. So again, he got there in 94. They renewed the agreement, I think, in 96. So this is 98. Based on May of 98. It's at a period of time where Hulk Hogan has leverage. And WCW is rolling. And according to this, the term would be from 98 through May 2002. The bonus here. In consideration of Bolea's performance hereunder, WCW shall pay Bolea a bonus in the amount of $2 million. To be paid within 14 days after the execution and delivery of this letter of agreement. He will promote and appear and wrestle and perform 6 pay-per-views during the year, 1 through 3, and he will be the featured wrestler at each event. In consideration for the pay-per-view appearances, WCW shall compensate him 15% of 100%, so 15% of what comes in, of domestic pay-per-view cable sales received by WCW.
Good Lord.
Or a $675,000 guarantee payment per event. So whichever number is better.
Whichever is greater.
WCW shall also pay him $1,350,000 on July 1st, November 1st, and February 1st of years 1 through 3. So again, this is just page 1. This doesn't even go into creative control and merchandise and everything else. It was a fantastically lucrative deal for Hulk Hogan, and it helped get the company to the point they were at this point in 1998.
And that was from 1998 to 2002?
Yeah.
It probably didn't work too well for him in 2000.
That's what I'm saying. It was one thing to get to this point, and he had the best deal, but he wasn't the only person with a great deal. And a lot of these deals are what ended up hurting WCW to the point that it died.
Well, that was easy to sign those deals when you're making $50 million. But when you lose $50 million, or was it $60 million? I'm sorry, in 2000. Then those dim are the deals what try men's souls.
Yeah, and the WCW run, again, we've talked about it in the past, and the Goldberg match, which went from not being a match to being a dark match to Hogan seeing that it was going to draw and the Turner executives being there to becoming the biggest drawing match in WCW history on free TV. And it was a big deal. I mean, we just talked about Goldberg retiring. That match is one of the reasons why Goldberg is a big deal. And Hogan put him over because he realized it was the best thing for him to do. You know, how often do you say that about Hogan? Hogan realized the best thing I could do in front of all these executives and this big house is put over Goldberg.
Well, because in the end, all the executives were patting him on the back for drawing it when they sold most of the tickets in advance to begin with, and he wasn't even on the card. He wasn't even there. But that's the thing, is that, again, he knew when to put himself in the right place. All these instances in the wrestling business, how did he go so wrong in his own personal life with not knowing how to put himself in the right places at the right times?
You know, again, he's still working for the WWF in the early 2000s after his WCW. Well, I guess towards the end of it, he came in 2002.
No, he waited because remember, he had one of the contracts that even when WCW went out of business, was sold, whatever the fuck, Turner Broadcasting or whatever the corporate entity was, had to pay him the rest of his contract. That's why several of those top guys did not migrate over to WWF until 2002, because they were still getting paid to sit on their ass at home.
And he comes back. They bring back the NWO. Vince brings him in. And he has that match with The Rock, which steals WrestleMania. It's a match that everyone talks about to this day. It's such an amazing match.
I forgot. Somebody just retweeted. We did a watch along of that.
That's right.
And it's, I assume, on the YouTube channel where people could avail themselves of it if they so desire. But yeah, where he completely, again, he outworked The Rock. I mean, psychology and with knowing what to do and etc. You know, that they had to completely flip around with the little things that, you know, that would have been ahead of Rock at that point in time in his career.
Yeah, and he does interesting things. I mean, he ends up teaming with Edge. I think they win the tag titles. He becomes the masked Mr. America. He has a match with Vince McMahon. I mean, there was a lot of really interesting things. And then he was gone again. And around this period of time, before TNA, and that's a whole nother story, I'll let you talk about that. But this really began the demystification of Hulk Hogan. That reality show starts, and you start seeing him with his family, and they do a ton of media together. I remember them on Howard Stern, you know, together. But I think people seeing Hogan and his family didn't make a lot of people want to see more of them. And then eventually, when the scandal hits with Bubba the Love Sponge's wife, again, that comes on the heels of seeing this guy and his family and his wife and his son all over the place for years. And then his son gets into the accident where that other kid gets messed up. It was a series of bad events outside of wrestling. And then inside of wrestling, there's TNA, there's that Australia tour with him and Flair having those matches where they busted each other up. But you were there right before he got to TNA.
Well, and also none of those did any favors, as you said. And I think especially the reality show familiarity with those people bred some level of contempt. It's just like, enough is enough of these fucking people, right?
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, Hogan became like the ultimate Florida man. You know, you always hear these stories, Florida man did this, Florida man did that. He was like the king of Florida man, because he was all about being based in Florida. Anyone who was a big mocker in the Tampa, Clearwater area, they knew him. I mean, I watched a documentary not too long ago about Lou Pearlman, the guy who ended up stealing all the money from a variety of people. He managed the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, and I guess for a time, Brooke Hogan. Hogan's all over that documentary, not being interviewed, but just in clips from being around. He became almost like a local celebrity there, separate from being a national celebrity.
But that's the point I was going to make, is you mentioned that, at the same time the Australia tour, and the guy had a lot of money, but Rick and Hogan both, at that point, I think they were at the time where people didn't want to see them rolling around bleeding anymore. And enough is enough. You guys have reached an age at some point where this must come to an end. And it wouldn't. It did for Hulk Hogan, it did for Rick. But I said when we were talking about the TNA agent reports that I've been pulling out of the files and other things, TNA stories lately, that without having any idea anything was going to go on with Hulk Hogan, Uh, I told Terry Taylor, I said, you couldn't even wait till I hear Ferrara's coming, or I would have fucking quit when Hogan and Bischoff came in the next month anyway, right? And well, why would you have quit with Hogan and Bischoff coming in? Not again. Well, I wasn't fond of Eric because of that previous brief interaction in WCW, but I didn't know anything about Hulk Hogan as a person. But I knew that no, this cause is lost. Jeff Jarrett's gone, Dutch Mantel's gone. They've already been burying these young guys that are hungrier, easier to work with, and more exciting. And the creative already sucks. And now it's going to be a Hogan Bischoff thing when, I mean, truthfully and honestly, as we've seen for the 25 years, that was his MO. When Hogan comes in, all of his friends come with him. It's just at that point, all of his friends was 20 years older. And with Bischoff, the feedback that I'd always gotten on Eric Bischoff and still have to this day from anybody whose opinion about creating or booking or promoting wrestling that I respect is that Eric Bischoff knows a lot about sales and talking to TV people, and you would be astonished at what Eric Bischoff doesn't know about wrestling. So I wouldn't have wanted to, and as the product bore out, they had just got to the point, I believe, where they were either about to or almost had, or maybe even did in TNA break even there in the fall of 2009. And it went downhill from there and has only recently resurged 15 years later.
Yeah, as a WWE satellite, which is what it needed to be, I guess, to succeed. But that was the whole.
Well, yeah, but it didn't need to be the satellite of Bischoff and Hogan Hervey fucking Enterprises.
That's the thing. Yeah. You know, it was the whole idea that Bischoff and Hogan were coming in to save things, or coming in to, you know, make things big again. And we're going to have a live show, or we'll go opposite Raw. We'll have all these stars and Jeff Hardy and the Nasty Boy. It didn't work. It didn't feel right.
Well, here's at that point, and Hogan is one of those guys that his personality was so big and his reputation was so big, and the magnitude of him, right? That you needed to get him out of the way to get other people over. That if he was too old at the time to be a top in-ring talent, but he overshadowed in a lot of cases the other guys they were trying to use. You see what I'm saying? And also, it was just old at that point. It was just stale. It was done.
And they have that last image of him leaving while dragging Dixie Carter, who's hanging onto his leg, and then he never comes back. He goes back to WWF. Then the scandal breaks out. He's gone. They remove him from the Hall of Fame for a few years. He comes back. He gives that speech to the locker room that does not go over well because he did not apologize. And, you know, he's kind of been an on and off presence over the last few years. It's crazy to think the last appearance he had was when he got booed out of the building in LA, which in a lot of ways was a tone-deaf appearance that WWE put him out there.
Yeah.
But, you know, he got booed. And then he did an interview with Ariel Helwani where he said, of course I did. I was Hollywood Hogan out there with everything. No, he wasn't. I mean, he lied about it.
Jimmy Hart was waving an American fucking flag. Like, fuck you. Fuck out of here. But, and that's between the lack of apologies and the continuing revelations of, well, this wasn't true. And remember, he ripped his shirt off and said Donald Trump was his hero. And that caused a lot of people to start taking a piss on him.
Yeah, that was like 6 months or so before Raw. So that was in the air. That's right.
It was in the air like one of Andre's farts. And I assume he's one of the people that his wife or one of his wives or some blonde person that he has married has led him to God also, because he's been doing the just over the top religious thing, which you can't take seriously from a guy that says he used to wrestle 500 times a year because he flew backwards from Japan. But, you know, he was over the top with that, like he's over the top with everything else. I think that is just all those things have various, it's a cumulative thing, like it was when he was wrestling other baby faces or people that the fans liked. When he's done things that a variety of people, maybe in small numbers, but like the Who's down in Whoville, it gets louder. Cumulatively, a lot of people said, I don't like this fucking guy anymore.
Yeah, and a few years ago, he got married, and the woman he married was apparently a big to-do in Scientology. So a lot of people were thinking, like, oh, Hulk Hogan's going to become a Scientologist, which would have been amazing because he would have broken their whole audit system once they tried to interview him and get some real stories out of him or anything. But, she was apparently baptized with him a few years ago, so it may have gone the other way. He may have gotten her and
good Lord,
brought her to him under the good Lord, as you just said.
Oh, good Lord.
But, he was still doing interviews. I mean, that's one of the reasons we would always talk about him, is people would send us these interview clips where he's saying things that are just clearly not true. But he's so committed to saying them that he could almost convince you. And if you don't know anything, he would convince you. And random projects and products that would pop up. Now there's the Hulk Hogan Real American Beer commercials all over Raw, and Real American Freestyle Wrestling, once again, him and Bischoff. That was about to launch with him as the commissioner, and there were just articles in the paper a month ago, 2 months ago. Him and partners bought a building, or bought a storefront across from Madison Square Garden to open up a Hulk Hogan bar.
That's right. I remember we talked about that at the time.
Or him and investors are looking to buy Hooters. And, we should say, because we talked about...
I've been out there looking to buy a few Hooters in my time, but I didn't realize he was that frisky these days. You mean the restaurant?
The restaurant chain. And I believe it's also based in Florida, or at least originally. But, we talked about the Bubba the Love Sponge stories a few weeks ago when he started coming out, I believe, again, the same market, I believe it's still Tampa, saying that he was hearing that Hulk Hogan was on his deathbed. Of course, they had a big falling out. You have to say, it turns out he probably knew what he was talking about, a lot of these things. We started hearing from people, without exposing any sources, a variety of people who seemed to, more than one person, who seemed to be aware based on what they were saying of certain things happening medically. And it seemed to be a pretty grim picture. They kept putting out positive statements. I know Jimmy Hart the other day said that everything was fine. He was doing karaoke with Nick the other night. But it was clear that there were some really serious medical issues. And, they said cardiac arrest. It hits suddenly. And again, like I said, it's a conflicted feeling for a lot of us. It's a very complicated legacy. It's the character. It's the important role the character played and the things that the character was a part of. And then it's the real person who, at times, seemingly without being malicious, was an incredibly self-absorbed, self-obsessed carny, for lack of a better term. And it may have worked for him throughout his life, but it creates this situation where an all-time legend, again, like you said at the very top of this, taking Jim Londos out of the equation, the biggest star we've ever seen in this country for professional wrestling. But there's a lot of conflicted thoughts when trying to evaluate and weigh what kind of guy he was.
Well, and, as you said, it's the person and the gimmick, but I think this is a case where they became the same thing. I mean, it is not a new story in wrestling. He spent almost 50 years convincing people that he was Hulk Hogan, except during that lawsuit when he said, no, he's a completely different guy with a completely different penis size. But he had to be Hulk Hogan. And, we've always said you don't get to be a big star without having a big ego. Sometimes you have a big ego, you don't get to be a big star, but both can be trouble. He was somewhat of a Teflon guy, in that when he got in trouble in one respect, he would be bailed out from another, quarter coming in. I think he got caught up in that and started believing his own shit and just felt like that's who he has to be, maybe in public and in private. As I said, I don't know. I'm looking from the outside, because that's why I can say that I neither personally liked him or disliked him. And as we've been able to have this conversation about what we saw, like everybody else saw.
But again, very few people ever have had or ever could have the impact he had on the professional wrestling business. You bring up The Rock and Steve Austin, Jim Londos, Bruno Sammartino, Ric Flair. It's a very short list of the top tier in terms of star power, drawing ability. It's a very short list, and he's in the conversation for top 3. You could argue if he's number 1 or where he is, but undoubtedly the biggest star of the last 45, 50 years in this country, if not ever, for professional wrestling.
Oh yeah, I think you can say since the dawn of television, the biggest star over that checks all the boxes. But anyway, we don't take any pleasure in that. We will miss taking the piss out of his stories. Because I'm pretty sure that us taking the piss out of his bullshit stories that he told and having fun with it never once affected any dollar that might come into his checkbook, and or I don't know that he ever lost any sleep over it, right? So I feel that our hands are clean.
Those are some of the most fun moments in the history of the show, is just us laughing, as we're discovering these things of what he said. Sometimes we play audio, sometimes we'd read quotes. Harley Race burned the ring down and then shook his hand and asked for a job. I mean, just crazy stuff. I'm hanging out with Michael Jackson and Mr. T at Wembley Stadium. Just crazy things that don't necessarily add up. But it was so much fun discussing any of these things, his book, all these things. And,
Or Ron Howard. What's going to happen to Ron Howard down at the beach store?
Oh, I'm sure whoever runs his estate will have to keep these things open. I mean, it's a valuable brand, you would think, going forward.
But I mean, is it going to be a new broom sweeps clean, a new administration, or is Ron still going to be the ruler of the roost? Does he have some kind of contract with the future owners of the name, image, and likeness?
You know who I actually found myself thinking about 2 different people when I heard this news. One was Brooke Hogan, just because they were just a series of articles about everything between her and her mom had put out a video, I think, where she looked somewhat unhinged, ranting about family issues. And Brooke Hogan put out a statement, and I felt really good for her. It just seemed like she was in a good place and had her own family and didn't want to be involved with her family's self-induced drama. And I thought about her just because, obviously her and her dad were very close and they had issues. And whatever reason, it made me think of her. And the other person was Jimmy Hart, who, so much of his life, seemingly, his career, has been the Hulk Hogan business since at least 93. I mean, everything with him publicly is him dressed in the Hulk Hogan colors, with the Hulk Hogan megaphone, at times waving the American flag. But, he did a lot of things for Hulk Hogan, and it ate up, not in a bad way, but it ate up a lot of his time. It was a lot of his life. And I ended up thinking about him too. Just, I hope he's okay.
Well, yeah, and I do too. If Jimmy is listening, and I hope to God you're not listening, Jimmy. I hope you're out busy like you usually like to be instead of sitting around listening to us. But we hope you're okay also. I've known Jimmy longer than Hulk has. But yeah, that's the thing. And at the same time, Jimmy's always out doing his own stuff. Jimmy's doing things that we never hear about or dream of, but he can't sit still from my experience with him. But they've worked together. Hulk knew how valuable Jimmy was and how he could trust him, how he's honest, he's dependable. He knows how to do promotion. He's a workaholic. And so they've had some type of professional relationship for, over 30 years now. So, I do feel bad for Jimmy because that's a big part of his life, as you said. But probably the only one we don't feel bad for is Linda, because she looks nuts. I don't know. She looked like fucking whatever happened to Baby Jane material.
Well, maybe that's reason to feel bad enough. But Hulk Hogan, 71 years old, the face of wrestling for a lot of fans, for a lot of non-fans, and certainly a complicated legacy that we'll continue to discuss going forward.
But in the meantime, as they say, Thanks for the house, Hulkster. Eric Bischoff tweeted that, and I thought that was succinct and said it all, because that's in the old days where you would go up to the guy in the main event and say, thank you for the house, because everybody made more money. It was on the card because you were in the main event. That was the meaning of that before all this handshake shit started.
Guys wanted to be on, in the 80s, guys wanted to be on the Hulk Hogan shows. WWF had 3, sometimes 4 shows a night. Guys really wanted to be on the shows with Hogan. You knew you'd make more money.
You knew what else you were going to see, don't you?
On those shows in the 80s with Hogan on top? No.
The big boot.
Of course.
The big boot, baby. And I'll tell you what, not to have a morbid transition, but this is broadcasting and we do have sponsors. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to say that one of them has recently come back and said, give us some more of that. You got any more of that sponsorship, baby? Because apparently our friends at Brunt over at BruntWorkwear.com have had tremendous response from the listeners of the various programs, the Cult of Cornette audience, the people out there. Well, they've been booting themselves up. They've been tying those boots up tight, baby, and getting out there and doing the work. And that's why you, if you haven't already done it, you got to know about the Brunt. The boots from Brunt.
I've already done
the workwear kind.
I told you I already did it. What do you mean I got
Well, I'm talking the royal U's.
These are great boots. I love them.
The U's out there. You see what I'm saying to you? The other U's, not you there, but the U's out there. Because I mentioned that I got these things. It's been a couple of months ago now, and I've been out feeding the deer. If the grass is wet, if it ever does rain, I don't slip because of the not only waterproofness of the Marin boot, but it's lightweight because I'm already trucking deer feed down there. So they don't weigh me down. They're waterproof and they're slip resistant. They got the treads on the bottom so I don't slip when it's rained on the wet grass and break my neck. But you can muck out the creek, or you can go and trim trees, or you can cut branches, or you can haul wheelbarrows, or you can do miscellaneous work of all kinds, even involving electricity and oil and shit like that. Well, it says they're electrical hazard rated, but I don't know what kind of work electricians do because I'm not one. But I've wheelbarrowed shit around the yard and they're just fucking peachy. And they don't hurt the callus I've got on my toe. You can actually adjust the amount of padding inside. You can slip one of these things out. You can fold it up. You can put it back in. You can adjust the inside of your softness of your boot. Did you adjust the softness of your boot?
And I was playing around with that like a week and a half ago. I was talking to Suzanne about them, and then she said, put them on. Let me see them. And they are so comfortable. They are the best boots I've ever owned. So thank you, Brunt.
Well, the construction is amazing. These things are put together and made and handcrafted and whatever better than the shoes that I used to wear on national television. I wish I'd have known about. I would have just painted them black and nobody would have known the difference. But folks, Brunt's best-selling Marin work boots, or the Omen work boots, which are slightly different but also fine quality, they're available. They're not only built for the toughest job sites, they're waterproof, whether it's rain, mud, standing water. You can swim in these fucking things. Well, you better be a pretty good swimmer if you're going to go into water too deep. But from oily workshop floors to muddy farm fields and everywhere in between, the Marin 6-inch soft toe is built for workers across a variety of trades. So if you want to trade some workers, I got a couple over here. I want 3 of yours. I'll give you 2 of mine. But they're all wearing Brunt work boots.
That's right.
Can you trade some of your workers, Brian?
Can I trade my worker? No, the people who, I don't know what we're talking about. Ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, it says these, they're built for workers across a variety of trades. So I've got some workers I'll trade you. Get some variety going on in here.
I think Julio
the folks at Brunt
here with me. Yes, go ahead.
Well, Julio's down by the schoolyard now. That Brunt knows they've got the best boots on the planet, so they will let you try any of their products on the job. And it's not even just boots. They've got a full range of high-performance gear built for tough jobs. You ought to see the goddamn Roman chastity belt that they have constructed. Boy, you can strap that thing on. The O-rings are made of welded steel.
I don't know anything about that, but what we are talking about are the great boots
The
that you can get
boots.
from Brunt.
Yes, well, choosing work boots used to mean sacrificing comfort or durability. But Brunt thought that was a bunch of BS, so they made comfortable boots that feel great from day one. You don't even have to break these in. And I got blisters on the heel from the last boots I had, but I got no blisters from these because they're so soft and just warm and inviting. But people out there doing real work ought to be comfortable. So all of Brunt's boots are built to last and to wear, and they're tired of the other workwear brands out there cutting corners because you work too hard to be stuck in the uncomfortable boots that don't hold up. Remember I told you I had to duct tape a sole of my yard boots on one time?
That's right.
Because it had just flapped open. I was in danger of having ticks on my toes. But Brunt is going to keep you tickless, and for a limited time now, our listeners are going to get $10 off when you use the code JCE at checkout. Go to Brunt, BRUNT, workwear.com. Use the code JCE. You're going to get $10 off on these wonderful fine boots, whichever ones that you select to put on your fine little tootsies. And when they ask you where you heard about Brunt, tell them that once again, the cult of Cornette is coming to have their feet shod in stylish fashion, courtesy of our program here. $10 off, Brunt, workwear.com. The code is JCE, the best boots in the world. And also, if you've got smelly, stinky feet, because these are waterproof, it'll keep the odor inside. So wear these to dinner with your family, and your wife and kids will thank us.
Again, you're not necessarily saying anything bad, but I don't know if that's necessarily a selling point, but
it's a bonus that you might not think about on an everyday basis. But if you're the smell of your tootsies when you're just hanging around in your house would bluff a maggot off a gut wagon, then now is the time to put these Brunt workwear boots on and hold that stench in while you're around your loved ones.
Once again, these boots are beautiful. They are comfortable. They are practical. I really love them. I'm very happy they're here with us. I know Jim likes them, and we think you will as well. Jim, in a very nice professional fashion, what's the way the listeners can get a hold of these fine boots and the fine workwear from Brunt?
Well, I believe I've mentioned it. $10 off at bruntworkwear.com with the promo code JCE.